Justice. Dikaiosynē. Justice is the central concern of Plato in his dialogues. It's not hard to imagine why. Socrates, Plato's teacher, was unjustly put to death by the state of Athens. This was something Plato never forgave or forgot, but it did spur him to question the nature of justice, which is what began the entire tradition of Western philosophy. Plato is sometimes remembered as a metaphysician and epistemologist, a philosopher who posited about how the universe came to be and how we can know anything in this life. Plato's many afterlives are just as interesting as his actual life, but they obscure some important realities about Plato and his mission in his life. Later Neoplatonists, Plotinus being the most famous, reinvented Plato as a mystic. They did this by claiming that they possessed certain secret lost dialogues which revealed Plato to be a mystic philosopher. Not long after the Neoplatonic remaking of Plato, a new religion from Judea spread into the Greek world. Several centuries after taking hold, Christian theologians, in their cultural and intellectual struggles against academic skepticism and the remnants of Roman paganism, enlisted the Neoplatonic version of Plato into their ranks. Plato was pursuing truth, and while not a Christian, shared many Christian values and virtues. St. Justin Martyr, and most famously St. Augustine, are those Christians who brought forth a Christianized version of Plato, and Plato gets yet another makeover during the Renaissance. While the Neoplatonic and Christian versions of Plato have some truth to them, Plato does have metaphysical, mystical, and epistemological implications in his philosophy. The fact is, Plato was a philosopher of justice first and foremost. In fact, if the history of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, we can extrapolate further that Western philosophy begins and ends with the question of justice. What is justice is the principal question of philosophy, as begun by Plato. The question and pursuit of justice, however, was not the invention of Plato. Justice and understanding of justice prior to Plato is also found in the playwrights and the dramatists. And this is why Plato was such a staunch opponent of the poets. It is wrongly asserted that Plato was an enemy of the poets, as if he was just an opponent to poetry. As many scholars now recognize, this is one of the worst understandings you can possibly have when understanding Plato. This perception comes from an improper understanding of Plato having Socrates banish the poets in his ideal city, in the Republic. But we must recognize that first, Plato wanted to be a dramatist. Second, Plato writes in dramatic dialogue form, often employing dramatic tropes, and the mythos, the myths, the stories in his own writings that spur and develop into rational philosophy. Third, imagery and rhetoric are the main drivers of Plato's rational inquiries, the logos. So in short, Plato was actually, as every serious scholar of Plato now knows, something of a dramatic artist in his own right, even if we consider him a philosopher, and his writings philosophical instead of dramatic. But we might go as far as to say that Plato's dialogues, his philosophies, contain the drama of justice within them. If Plato was an artist, the critic might ask, why did he despise the poets and the playwrights? As we've hinted at, it was the poets and the playwrights' view of justice that was Plato's main objection. Read the Republic carefully when discussing the ban on the poets. What they taught, the morality and understanding of justice in their works, was what Plato was objecting to, not the artistry of poetry itself, because again, Plato's entire philosophical corpus is a dramatic artwork. In Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, justice is related to the powerful and forceful. Those with the most power and most brute force, the gods or the animals, are the ones with whom justice resides. In the Republic, Thrasymachus reiterates this ancient and now reactionary understanding of justice as simply belonging to the most powerful. After Hesiod, justice was understood as a cosmic reality related to retribution or revenge. Aeschylus's magisterial Oresteia is the best example of this, even if Orestes is acquitted by the end of the play. The plays of Euripides also often deal with vengeful justice, where individuals so clearly wronged take matters into their own hands, often killing or maiming the ones who committed harm unto them. This understanding of retributive justice is still the predominant understanding by the time we get to Herodotus. What we find in the playwrights, then, is an understanding of justice that is related to brute force, power, and ultimately death. In other words, killing your enemy is what is ultimately just. And, of course, this is what Athens employed against Socrates, despite the propaganda sloganeering about democracy and freedom. Plato was able to see through the veil of political and rhetorical lies. Plato's commitment isn't to any particular political form or system, but to justice itself. This returns us to Plato's understanding of justice. At the beginning of the Republic, we see a glimpse into Plato's parsing out of a justice based on force and a justice based on rationality. Plato parses out the two visions of justice which predominate in Greek society, or rather, the one version of Greek justice, the justice based on force, power, versus the justice that he is articulating, based on rationality. Returning from a festival, Socrates and his friends are stopped by a slave boy of Polemarchus. Socrates says here, "I went down yesterday with Glaucon, son of Ariston, to pray to the goddess, and at the same time I wanted to observe how they would put on the festival, since they were now holding it for the first time. Now, in my opinion, the procession of the native inhabitants was fine, but the one the Thracians conducted was no less fitting a show. After we had prayed and looked on, we went off toward town. Catching sight of us from afar as we were pressing homewards, Polemarchus, son of Cephalus, ordered his slave boy to run after us, and ordered us to wait for him. The boy took hold of my cloak from behind and said, 'Polemarchus orders you to wait.' And I turned around and asked him where his master was. 'He is coming up behind,' he said. 'Just wait.' 'Of course we'll wait,' said Glaucon. A moment later, Polemarchus came along with Adimantus, Glaucon's brother. Polemarchus said, 'Socrates, I guess you two are hurrying to get away to town.' 'That's not a bad guess,' I said. 'Well,' he said, 'do you see how many of us there are?' 'Of course.' 'Well then,' he said, 'either prove stronger than these men or stay here.' 'Isn't there still one other possibility?' I said. 'Our persuading you that you must let us go?' 'Could you really persuade,' he said, 'if we don't listen?' Right from the beginning, Plato, who employs a brilliant dramatic technique called foreshadowing, informs his readers what the dialogue is about: force and persuasion, power and rationality. The themes of force and persuasion, power and rationality will be related to justice as the dialogue proceeds, and Socrates engages with his sophist interlocutors, beginning with Thrasymachus, who makes the conversation about justice explicit when he barks, "I say that the justice is nothing more than the advantage of the stronger." Plato recoils, of course, at this notion. He knows that this conception of justice is found in the playwrights, the rule of the strong. Here, the rule of the strong doesn't matter if it is at the individual or the collective level. The rule of might does not make right regardless of how it manifests in Plato's mind. As the dialogue develops, we begin to see Plato's understanding of justice coming to fruition. Harmonious cooperation between all persons working together on behalf of the polis. This is why, for a very long time, Plato was actually considered a sort of proto-socialist or even a proto-communist. Plato's conception of political life, where justice is the governing spirit, is admittedly a collective endeavor. However, it is somewhat misleading to consider Plato a socialist or a communist because Plato was not a materialist. He did not believe in the workers owning the means of production, and he was not an egalitarian. Hierarchies abound in Plato. He takes hierarchy as a given reality of existence. Furthermore, Plato's concern for justice is also a concern for liberty. Plato is an opponent of tyranny, which always produces injustices, because tyrannical injustice destroys the aristocratic liberty of the soul, as happened with Socrates. Plato is equally a social and political critic who deconstructs the facades of the earthly city. He exposes democratic Athens as being cruel, tyrannical, and unjust, despite their rhetoric to the contrary. This is also why Plato was a significant influence over aspects of 20th century postmodernism. It is not simply the Republic that this question and pursuit of justice is the principal Platonic concern. We find it in the other great dialogues of Plato too. The Laws, the Crito, and the Euthyphro are among three of the most obvious and critical examples. All of them are dealing with juridical justice in some fashion or form, questions into the nature of law and how one is to relate to law, especially in relationship to the self and with others. This permits us to begin understanding Plato's association of justice with rationality or persuasion, the logos. Persuasion is a means to achieve justice instead of force, or even the rule of law. In the Laws, for instance, Plato is anything but conservative. The Athenian stranger comes as an outsider, an instigator, a questioner, a challenger. Cleinias is the defender of the old ways, the traditions, the divine revelation from the gods to humanity. Over the course of the dialogue, the Athenian stranger destroys Cleinias's traditionalist beliefs. Cleinias eventually invites the Athenian stranger to aid in the constructing of a new constitution. Sometimes existing laws are not good and therefore need changing, especially if existing laws are unjust. Throughout the Laws, Plato turns Hesiod on his head. The myth of Kronos in Hesiod's Theogony is the turning point of that epic. Kronos, spurred on by the injustice of Urania in raping Gaia and ruling the cosmos with tyrannical lust, takes a sickle fashioned by Gaia and castrates the Sky Father. This leads to the birth of the Olympians, starting with Aphrodite, from the castrated phallus of Uranus as it falls into the sea. Lust, sex, and war govern Hesiod's cosmos. This is the traditional view of the cosmos that is also eminently unjust. This is not the story of Kronos Plato gives us. Rather, Kronos is given a rational makeover, a makeover with the logos. The violence which governed the myth from the earlier poets is washed away in Plato's rationalization of the cosmos. This too is what we find in the Timaeus. While the later Neoplatonists reinterpreted this text to create Plato the mystic, which of course had a tremendous influence over Christian interpretations of Plato, the Timaeus is instructive in Plato's own rationalist myth-making and artistic criticism. As in the Laws, Plato is directly rebutting the cosmogonies of the poets and the playwrights, the dramatists. Rationality becomes the governing spirit of the cosmos, from which order and understanding emanate. Chaos and war, the pillars that built Hesiod's cosmos, are no longer present in Plato. Rationality and order, with their necessary relation to mathematics, drawing from Pythagoras, is now the heart, the governing heart of the cosmos. The Timaeus is, in fact, a political dialogue. Although it nominally deals with the creation of the cosmos, the dialogue has political overtures, as any attentive reader recognizes. At the end of Timaeus's speech explaining the origins of the cosmos in rationality, order, and mathematics, the dialogue returns to the questions and debates of the political. After talking about the cosmos and bodily health, Plato has Timaeus state, in addition, when men who are constitutionally unsound, as I've been describing, live in cities with pernicious political systems and hear correspondingly pernicious speeches at home and in public, and when, moreover, what they learn from childhood onward does nothing at all to remedy all of this, these two factors, which have nothing whatsoever to do with one's own choice, are responsible for the badness of those who become bad. With a quick switch, Plato has us return to the earthly city with its concerns over political systems, whether they are just, and how we are to respond to them. The intent is clear. Rationality and mathematical order and proportionality. The rationality, the mathematical order, the proportionality of the cosmos is something knowable to us as humans and therefore imitatable on earth. And the imitation of the rationality and proportionality of the cosmos is the basis of justice for political life, because we can have a cooperative relationship and endeavor in this. The harmony that Plato seeks is not a harmony imposed by force. That is a false harmony, but one that arises from persuasive agreement, which leads to cooperation. Universal truth is something we can all rationally understand and live by. Universal truth is now the governing spirit of life, rather than force and violence. One need not agree with Plato, but one must do Plato justice in representing his views, especially on political matters. Those who do not make justice the central concern for Plato are not talking about Plato at all. It's unsurprising that after 2.5 millennia, the ghost of Plato is still with us. We are still his children. We are still asking the question that he asked. What is justice? That question remains unsettled, just as it was in Plato's time. I began by noting that Western philosophy begins and ends with this concern, this question for justice. This is what Plato bequeathed to the world. But more than that, Western philosophy also begins with a question, as I pointed out. What is justice? Our philosophical tradition encourages questions, dialogue, and ultimately friendship. Friendship is another of the major themes throughout Plato's corpus. Thrasymachus becomes a friend of Socrates over the course of the Republic. Strangers become friends with each other as they walk and talk in each other's company, debating and discussing the question of justice. This is not accidental or unintentional on Plato's part. Friendship is married to justice throughout his works. The questions that Plato asks about the nature of justice do not occur in lonely solitude or isolation. They arise in the company of others. It is a social endeavor. for that is the only way for proper persuasion, not by the imposition of brute force over others, but through a dialogue with others that changes minds and ultimately forms friendships. We might go as far as to say that Plato implies friendship as the basis for which justice can emerge in the world. Without friends, we only have enemies. When we only have enemies, we return to the world of Hesiod and Thrasymachus prior to his friendship with Socrates, where might makes right and the obliteration of enemies is considered justice, a return to that older, retributive, and vengeful justice spoken of by the playwrights and even spoken of by Herodotus. And that, Plato informs us, is injustice writ large, with a tyrannical spirit antithetical to the life, the rational, persuasive life offered in friendship, from which justice ultimately flows.